Welcome to the desert where laughter once echoed louder than engines, where men pointed at steel giants crawling through dust and said they'll never make it. Welcome to the place where arrogance met fire, and the sand itself decided who deserved to survive. They laughed at the tanks first. The sun was their ally, they said. The dunes were their fortress. The Americans had built monsters too heavy, too loud, too fragile for this place. Tanks, they joked. In the desert, they'll sink before they fight. Their laughter carried across the valley, soft at first, then cruel, rolling like wind between the mountains. But the desert has a way of turning laughter into echoes, and echoes into warnings. It began as a faint vibration beneath the sand, that low mechanical growl that tells you something alive is coming. A sound that didn't belong here growing louder, heavier, closer. The ground trembled, birds scattered, and the horizon started to move. Steel tracks cut across the dunes, engines roared under the morning sun, and suddenly the desert wasn't laughing anymore. The first blast came before dawn, a deep, thunderous crack that rolled through the hills like the voice of God. Flames rose in the distance, a plume of black smoke twisting against the red sky. And for one brief moment, every man who had mocked those tanks realized they weren't built to survive the desert, they were built to own it. June 1982, Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. The air shimmered with heat and fear. Somewhere above, a single jet screamed across the sky, low, fast, merciless. Below, American-built Pattons clawed their way forward, their armor painted with dust and defiance. Radios hissed orders, blurred hearts pounded against steel walls. The war that was supposed to be short, clean, predictable had just changed shape. And through it all, the desert watched, quiet, ancient, unblinking. It had seen men come with pride and leave with ashes. It had seen laughter before, but never like this. So before we begin, take a moment. Tell me where you're watching from, and the exact second you felt it, that shift in the air, that heartbeat, when confidence turns to silence. Because every war has that moment, the breath between laughter and loss, when history exhales and everything you thought you knew burns away. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from, and tell me the moment you felt it. That shift from noise to silence, from confidence to terror. Because in every war, there's that one breath where the laughter dies and history takes its first shot. June 6th. Dawn broke over the Lebanese border like a curtain of fire being drawn open. In the distance, the Golan Heights shimmered calm, ancient, deceptive. No one looking at that sunrise could have guessed it was the beginning of one of the most decisive armored confrontations since World War II. Operation Peace for Galilee had begun. Israel called it a limited strike, an attempt to push Palestinian Liberation Organization forces away from the northern towns of Galilee. But the moment their tanks crossed the Litani River, it became something far greater. Syrian divisions were waiting in the Bekaa Valley, and between them lay the perfect trap, long, narrow, flat, a natural corridor for tanks and for death. The air was already trembling with noise, a mix of diesel jet fuel and electricity. Israeli columns moved north from Metula Merkava Mokka 1s in the lead, followed by American-built M60A1 Pattons, the same design that had fought across Vietnam and the Sinai. Each tank carried 4 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, young, tired, silent. Many had trained with U.S. advisors at the Negev desert, learning how to fight blind in heat that could cook a man inside his armor. At 0615, radar stations on Mount Hermon detected movement formations of Syrian T-62s leaving their revetments near Baalbek. Soviet advisors stood behind them, giving clipped orders through interpreters. On their maps, the valley was drawn like a chessboard. They believed the Israeli tanks were too heavy, too dependent on Western maintenance that the dust and narrow passes would break them before the first shot was fired. They were wrong. Within hours, the skies above the valley filled with American metal F-15 Eagles, F-16 Falcons, A-4 Skyhawks, F-4 Phantoms, all flown by Israeli pilots, but guided by U.S. satellite data and electronic warfare aircraft orbiting high above the Mediterranean. In one of history's first true electronic battlefields, AWACS planes from NATO monitored every Syrian radar pulse, feeding live data to Israeli command centers in Haifa and Tel Aviv. The ground trembled under the movement of hundreds of armored vehicles. Israeli tank brigades under General Avigdor Ben-Gal, the same commander who had stopped the Syrians in 1973 on the Golan, advanced in tight formations. Behind them, logistics convoys snaked through the valleys carrying ammunition, food, and spare parts. Every engine sounded like a heartbeat, steady, disciplined, unstoppable. To the west, villages like Jezin Ale and Sidon were being shelled. Civilians fled as artillery pounded hillsides that had been quiet for centuries. Reporters embedded with the Israeli 90th Division wrote later that the heat was so intense, the air itself shimmered like it was on fire. On the Syrian side, the 1st Armored Division prepared its defenses. T-62s were dug into hull-down positions along the ridge of Dar el-Baidar. Anti-tank missile crews deployed Soviet AT-3 Sagar launchers, their operators lying prone in the rocks, waiting for silhouettes to appear through the mirage. Soviet officers, confident in their equipment, noted that their composite armor could resist the American 105mm shell. What they didn't know was that Israel's tanks were carrying new American-made kinetic penetrators, APF-SDS rounds capable of slicing through Soviet steel like butter at 2,000 meters. The first contact came near Lake Karaun at 7:42 a.m. Israeli recon units reported armored movement north of the Litani. The response was immediate. A pair of Skyhawks dove low, dropping cluster bombs over a Syrian convoy. Dust erupted into columns of smoke and radio chatter exploded with overlapping voices, Hebrew, Arabic, Russian. Engage! Engage! They're flanking from the east. By mid-morning, the entire Bekaa Valley had become a single sheet of fire. On Israeli channels, one phrase repeated, Kadima, Kadima, forward. On Syrian nets, another echoed, Sadir, Sadir, hold the line. Between them, in that narrow strip of earth, over 400 tanks clashed beneath a sun that burned at 45 degrees Celsius. Inside an M60, the temperature rose past 60 degrees Celsius. Crews wrapped towels around their necks, poured water over their radios, and kept fighting. Each tank was a world of its own darkness, vibration, deafening noise. Gunners worked blind through periscopes, firing on heat signatures and prayer. From the sky, AWACS recorded it all, infrared lines darting across the valley, small flashes where tanks died. By the end of that day, American analysts watching the feed in real time would call it the most one-sided armor engagement since Kursk. Yet for the men on the ground, it didn't feel like victory, it felt like drowning in heat and metal. The battle stretched into the afternoon. Israeli Phantoms swooped low, their engines shaking the windows in Damascus. Syrian SA-6 Gainful missiles tried to reach them, but were jammed by American ECM pods. One by one, the radar sites went dark. It was the beginning of the so-called Bekaa Valley Turkey Shoot, an air duel where Israel shot down 82 Syrian aircraft without losing a single plane. But down below, inside the valley floor, the war looked nothing like statistics. It was chaos, white smoke from burning diesel, black trails from ATGMs, cutting across the horizon, men shouting coordinates that no one could hear. A Syrian captain later captured said, "The sky fell first, then the ground opened." At 17 Huzron, General Ben-Gal's armored brigades reached the Damascus-Beirut highway. Columns of burning T-62s marked their path. Photographs taken by Reuters that evening showed Israeli tank crews resting on their turrets, faces black with soot, the setting sun behind them like an omen. In Haifa, the war room received a message Bekaa secured. It wasn't the end, but it was the turning point. The numbers that day were staggering. More than 350 Syrian tanks destroyed or abandoned. Israeli losses under 30. Analysts later attributed it to superior optics, infrared aiming, and battlefield coordination. But the men who fought there had simpler words. "We could see them," one said, "and they couldn't see us." Night fell, and the valley glowed red, not with sunset, but with fire. Each wreck was a torch marking where confidence had died. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning rubber. In the stillness, the only sound left was the hum of engines cooling in the dark. The next morning, when journalists arrived, they found the Bekaa Valley transformed not into a battlefield, but a graveyard. Rows of Soviet tanks, some still smoking, others frozen mid-turn, their crews gone. Locals stood in silence, staring at the twisted shapes half buried in sand. One man said quietly, "The desert remembers who mocks it. History remembers battles by their names. Soldiers remember them by their sounds." The Battle of the Bekaa Valley. June 1982. Had both. It was the first time the desert heard the hum of computers inside tanks, the pulse of satellites above them, and the laughter of men who thought they knew how war worked until they didn't. Before that summer, most analysts in Damascus and Moscow dismissed the M60A1 as an antique, a relic from Vietnam. Too slow, they said, too simple. The Soviets believed their T-72s newly supplied to Syria could erase them from the map. The T-72 had thicker armor, a faster gun, an autoloader, a marvel of 1970s engineering. But the men who built those tanks had never fought in the dust-choked valleys of Lebanon, where sand could blind optics and heat warped every round fired. The Israelis, equipped largely with American armor and doctrine, had learned the hard way in 1973 that technology without adaptation was suicide. The Yom Kippur War had nearly broken them, hundreds of tanks destroyed by Soviet-made Sagar missiles. That trauma reshaped everything. By 1982, the Israeli Armored Corps had become one of the most modernized ground forces on Earth, wired, networked, and rebuilt from the inside out. Each M60 Patton now carried a ballistic fire control computer, a laser rangefinder, and night vision systems developed under American contracts. They'd been upgraded with Blazer explosive reactive armor tiles designed to detonate outward and deflect the blast of anti-tank warheads. It was the first battlefield use of such technology in history. The old Patton was no longer old. It was the desert's new predator. On June 8, 1982, the first full-scale tank engagement unfolded near the village of Sultan Yaqub, a narrow valley south of Baalbek, surrounded by ridges that funneled armor like sheep into a slaughterhouse. Syrian forces had the high ground, 9th Armored Division reinforced with Soviet advisors, and roughly 120 T-62s and T-72s. The Israelis advanced under the command of Colonel Menachem Einan. 62nd Armored Battalion supported by mechanized infantry and artillery. At 09:40 hours, Syrian scouts spotted the Israeli column moving north. Radio chatter was confident. "We have them pinned in the open. The valley will be their grave." Soviet observers agreed. They'd seen the maps. The Israeli tanks had nowhere to maneuver. And then the Americans rolled in. From the sky came the sound, a formation of F-15 Eagles, F-16, Fighting Falcons and A-4 Skyhawks sweeping low through the Bekaa Valley, guided by real-time data from U.S. AWACS aircraft orbiting over the Mediterranean. It was the first combat demonstration of America's integrated air armor warfare. The Syrians' radar screens lit up hundreds of false signals. Electronic countermeasures flooded their systems with phantom blips. Missiles that should have tracked jets flew instead into empty sky. Communications broke down. Artillery calls went unanswered. The Syrians were blind, while Israeli crews were seeing through American eyes. Inside an M60 Patton, the gunner watched his thermal sight flicker to life. A white silhouette glowed on his scope. Target T-62, 800 meters. Range confirmed. Fire. The round left the barrel at 500 meters per second. 2 seconds later, a flash erupted across the ridge. The Soviet armor cracked open like tin under a hammer. The loader didn't celebrate. He just whispered next. For every Syrian shell that hit the sand, 5 Israeli rounds found their mark. US 105mm APF-SDS penetrators, long dart-like rods of tungsten, tore through armor the Soviets had sworn was invincible. The T-72's autoloader, a supposed advantage, became its curse. When the interior ignited, the ammunition carousel detonated, blowing turrets clean off their hulls. Satellite images taken that afternoon showed dozens of tanks burning in rows, each one a monument to overconfidence. The Americans were watching closely. In real time, U.S. analysts in the Pentagon studied feeds from Israeli reconnaissance drones, another first in modern warfare. They called it proof of concept. On paper, the Israeli armor shouldn't have survived that trap. But with American firepower and coordination, the trap collapsed inward. At 11:30, a Syrian officer, Major Khalid Fares, radioed in panic, "We are under attack from the ground and sky. They are inside our range before we can even lock." His words were recorded later by Western intelligence. 3 minutes after that transmission, his command tank was destroyed by a shell fired from 2.3 kilometers away. By noon, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The dust turned orange smoke rising in pillars that could be seen from Beirut. Reporters on the Israeli side described it as a moving wall of fire. One journalist from the Associated Press wrote, "It felt like watching the ghost of Patton himself walking through the valley." The Syrians tried to counter with their own air cover squadrons of MiG-21s and MiG-23s scrambled from Tias and Al-Dumair air bases. They never made it. Israeli pilots, using American-supplied AIM-9L Sidewinder missiles and radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrows, intercepted them in a dogfight that would later be called the Bekaa Valley Turkey Shoot. 82 Syrian aircraft were shot down in less than 2 days. Israel lost none. Down below, the tank crews fought in chaos. At Sultan Yaqub, an Israeli unit was encircled after pushing too far. 11 tanks trapped 23 soldiers missing or captured. Among them, Sergeant Zachary Baumel, an American-born Israeli whose remains wouldn't be recovered until 2019. Even victory has its ghosts, but tactically, strategically, the message was unmistakable. The Soviet model of warfare had been broken. The desert tanks they had mocked, those American-built machines sweating in the Lebanese heat, had not only survived, they had reshaped the entire concept of armored combat. In the following days, the U.S. Department of Defense released a confidential assessment. The 1982 Bekaa engagement demonstrated total battlefield superiority through electronic warfare, surveillance integration, and precision munitions. The combination of American technology and Israeli adaptation marks the end of traditional armor parity. Translated into simpler words, the laughter had ended. The Syrians withdrew from the valley within 72 hours. Their losses: over 350 tanks, 82 aircraft, multiple radar batteries, and 2 divisions shattered. Israeli losses: 30 tanks damaged or destroyed, many later recovered. When the smoke cleared, the Bekaa was silent again, except for the crackle of cooling metal. Locals climbed the hills and watched as bulldozers pushed the burnt carcasses of T-72s into ditches. American officers walked the fields days later, inspecting wrecks, noting the impact points, the angles, the precision. They called it a live laboratory of modern war. In Damascus, state radio denied everything. Minor losses, they said. Our forces withdrew for strategic reasons. But the world had already seen the photographs' columns of Soviet armor blackened beyond recognition, the desert littered with proof that technology and arrogance never mix. From Washington, President Ronald Reagan sent a brief statement. Freedom is defended not by laughter, but by readiness. That line would never make the headlines, but in the war rooms it was remembered. Because for the first time since Vietnam, American firepower, even through the hands of another nation, had rewritten how the world measured strength. The desert, once thought to be the great equalizer, had just proven the opposite. It favored those who listened, who adapted, who learned. And in June 1982, it was the American-designed steel that learned fastest. By nightfall, as the stars returned over Lebanon, you could still see the faint glow of fires on the horizon. Every wreck was a reminder that in the Bekaa Valley, laughter died first. Night hadn't fallen yet, but the valley was already dark. Smoke hung low over Sultan Yaqub, curling around the hills like black mist. The ground was still trembling from hours of shelling. Somewhere in that haze, a line of M60 Pattons crept forward, engines growling, each tank spaced exactly 50 meters apart, each crew counting the seconds between heartbeats. Inside one of them, Sergeant Zachary Baumel, 21 years old, born in Brooklyn, raised in Jerusalem, sat in the gunner's seat, one hand on the elevation wheel, the other gripping the scope handle. Sweat dripped down his helmet strap. His world was reduced to green light and static, the glow of the sight, the hum of the radio, the smell of diesel and powder. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight. The voice in his headset was calm, Israeli Hebrew laced with an American accent. "This is Harel. Advance 200 meters, then hold. We've lost contact with Bravo column." Baumel looked at his commander, Lieutenant Zvi Feldman, who nodded silently. The tank moved slow, deliberate. Outside, the world was a blur of heat and dust. They were deep in the valley now, surrounded by ridges that could show 1,000 guns. It was supposed to be a simple maneuver: push north, secure the crossroads, link up with paratroopers from the 890th Battalion. No one had told them the Syrians were waiting. The first rocket came from nowhere. A streak of light cutting the night, an AT-3 Sagar missile. Incoming, someone shouted, but it was too late. The missile slammed into the tank ahead, a column of fire burst upward, then silence. Baumel flinched as the shockwave hit ears ringing. Through his periscope, he saw silhouettes moving on the ridge, Syrian infantry, with launchers on their shoulders. Traverse left, 10 degrees, range, on 400, target acquired fire. The gun roared. The recoil slammed the turret like a heartbeat. The shell hit the ridge, a cloud of smoke erupting in slow motion. Someone cheered over the intercom, but it died quickly. Another explosion, this time closer. Metal screamed. Baumel's tank jolted to a halt. Driver reverse. The treads whined, then stopped. The engine coughed once, twice, then nothing. Dead. "Power out," said the driver. "We're hit, not penetrated, but something's gone." Static filled the radio. Baumel tried to call Harel's command unit, no response. Outside, chaos. Gunfire. Explosions. Voices shouting in Hebrew, Arabic, Russian. It was impossible to tell who was who anymore. He turned the turret manually, old-school muscles burning. Through the scope, he saw it, a line of Syrian T-62s advancing through the fog. 5 tanks, 10, maybe more. "Load heat," he barked. The loader slammed a shell into the breach. The smell of gunpowder hit like a punch. Up fire. The shot connected the lead. T-62 exploded its turret, lifting off like a coin flicked into the air. But there were too many. The Syrians fired back their shells, streaking like comets through the dust. Each explosion shook the ground. Dirt fell from the turret roof like rain. At 22, radio command finally broke through. "This is Harel, all units withdraw, repeat withdraw, south by grid 47. But by then the valley had closed behind them. The Syrians had circled in cutting off the retreat routes, targeting every tank that tried to move. Major Yehuda Harel's command vehicle took a direct hit. He survived barely. Dozens of his men didn't. 11 Israeli tanks were trapped in the valley, surrounded by 3 Syrian battalions. Bommel's was one of them. Through the smoke, he saw tracer fire cutting the darkness green for friendly, red for enemy. But even that distinction vanished when the wind changed. The valley turned into a storm of colors, fire and dust and sparks, all merging into one unbearable glare. At 23 Zugreros, the order came: abandon vehicles if immobilized. Some crews obeyed, some didn't. For many, the tank was the only shelter left. Bommel and his crew stayed inside, trying to repair the engine under fire. They could hear Syrian soldiers moving closer, shouting orders, their boots crunching on gravel. Then the radio, a faint voice. "This is Eagle 2. We're coming in from the west. Hold your fire." For a moment, hope. The sky above flashed with white light, Israeli flares parachuting slowly, illuminating the battlefield in ghostly glow. Every shadow stretched, every wreck became a monument. From above, A-4 Skyhawks dove, strafing Syrian positions. The noise was deafening, jets screaming at treetop height, bombs falling so close the ground itself seemed to ripple. For 15 minutes, the valley was pure chaos, the kind that only happens when both sides realize they might die in the same place. Then came the silence. When dawn broke, the air was heavy with smoke and ash. The ground was littered with wreckage, 20 Israeli tanks, over 80 Syrian. Men stumbled through the haze, coughing, calling names. Paratroopers from the 890th Battalion finally reached the valley, too late for most. In the confusion, 5 Israeli soldiers were captured alive. 23 were missing. Bommel was among them. His tank was found days later, burned, abandoned, its hatch open. The desert had taken him. For decades, no one knew what happened. His name appeared on lists and memorials in whispered prayers. But the war moved on, Lebanon faded, politics shifted, and Sultan Yaqub became just another chapter in the long, quiet grief of Israel's wars. But history has a strange way of circling back. In April 2019, 37 years later, his remains were recovered by Russian mediation from a grave near Yarmouk, Damascus. They identified him by a fragment of bone and the Star of David he had carried in his pocket. The soldier who vanished in the fire of 1982 finally came home. When his coffin landed in Tel Aviv, the crowd stood in silence. Old veterans of the 362nd Battalion saluted, their faces wet. One of them whispered to a reporter, "They laughed at our tanks, you know, said they'd never make it through the desert. But we did. We always do." And as the camera panned across the faces, the music faded, and the screen filled with the image of a single M60 Patton, restored, painted, standing in a memorial near Latrun. Its surface is scarred, its paint blistered by sun. On its turret, a plaque reads, "In memory of those who rolled into the fire and never rolled back." War, when seen from a distance, is a set of numbers, but inside the smoke, it's rhythm, contrast, cause and consequence. And nowhere was that contrast sharper than in the valley where men once believed the desert would devour the tanks. In the early weeks of June 1982, the Syrian army entered the war confident, not foolishly, but historically. Their Soviet advisors had assured them the T-72 outclassed any Western design. It was faster, smaller, better armored. The autoloader gave it a rate of fire no human loader could match. They believed they'd learned from the humiliation of 1967, and that this time the Soviet model would triumph where pride alone had failed. On paper, it was true. The Syrian 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions fielded nearly 1,400 tanks, a mix of T-55s, T-62s, and the new T-72s freshly shipped from Nizhny Tagil. Their gunners had trained on Soviet ranges. Their tactics followed Red Army doctrine: defense in depth, overlapping kill zones, ambush over maneuver. They had the terrain, the numbers, and the high ground. Israel had fewer tanks, about 800, mostly M60A1s, and the indigenous Merkava Mako 1. But they had something the Syrians didn't: integration. The invisible threads of American technology weaving sky to ground radar, to gunner satellite to soldier. Every movement in the valley was mirrored in Haifa's command room, where US-built computer consoles blinked with real-time telemetry. For the first time in Middle Eastern warfare, a commander could see the entire battlefield unfold as data. It was this not brute strength that decided the battle. At 08:00 on June 9th, Israeli electronic warfare units launched Operation Mole Cricket 19. It was surgical, invisible, devastating. Over the span of 2 hours, American-made AGM-78 Standard Arm missiles, anti-radiation weapons, systematically destroyed every Syrian radar site across the Bekaa Valley. 19 surface-to-air missile batteries, SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, went dark before the Syrians even knew they were being hunted. Electronic jammers aboard F-4 Phantoms flooded enemy radar with ghost images, entire Phantom squadrons that didn't exist. By noon, the skies were clean. By evening, Syrian pilots were flying blind, and then the real fire began. Israeli armor moved under perfect air cover, a luxury no Arab army had ever allowed them before. Every Syrian position that opened fire was instantly marked and eliminated by jets orbiting at altitude. For every tank duel below, there was a jet duel above, and both were being watched by satellites thousands of miles away. The Americans called it real-time warfare. The Syrians called it something else: mechanical sorcery. At the tactical level, the difference was as brutal as it was simple. A Syrian T-72's optical rangefinder was analog. It required manual adjustment, calculation, and line of sight. In the shimmering heat of the desert, its accuracy dropped to under 40%. An Israeli M60A1, upgraded with an American Hughes fire control computer, could fire on the move and hit with 90% precision at over 2 kilometers. That difference, a few seconds, a few degrees, was the difference between life and fire. By June 10th, Syrian formations began collapsing in sequence. Reports intercepted by Israeli intelligence described chaos: we can't see them. They shoot and we burn. They jam our radio's orders don't reach the line. One Soviet colonel reportedly tore off his headset and said, "We are fighting ghosts made of steel." In Damascus, Soviet diplomats urged restraint quietly. The Kremlin was watching, alarmed. Their newest export weapon, the T-72, was being humiliated by machines 20 years older, powered by American fire control logic. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a live demonstration beamed to every intelligence agency in the world. Washington knew it. Moscow knew it. At the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, analysts noted that in less than 72 hours, the Bekaa Valley had become a proving ground for the digital battlefield. America's invisible hand, its engineering satellites, missiles, and doctrine, had rewritten how the desert fought. It was no longer about courage. It was about who could see first and strike before the other realized it was being watched. In contrast, the Syrians fought bravely, desperately. At Sultan Yaqub, they managed to ambush an Israeli column, killing and capturing dozens. They called it a victory. And for a moment, it was a single flare of defiance in an ocean of wreckage. But the broader truth couldn't be buried. By June 11th, more than 400 Syrian tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Israel's loss count was under 30. Air losses: 82 Syrian aircraft downed to none on the Israeli side. It was the most lopsided kill ratio since 1945. The irony was bitter. For years, Soviet journals had mocked American armor as ill-suited to desert warfare. They laughed at the M60's bulky frame, its exposed engine grills, its outdated gun. But under the dust of Lebanon, that old tank had become a symbol, a bridge between human intuition and machine intelligence. It had outlived its ridicule. Somewhere in the valley among the smoking carcasses of T-72s, an Israeli commander radioed a simple phrase: "The laughter has stopped." No one wrote it down. No one needed to. It became the heartbeat of the entire campaign. From Washington, Pentagon observers compiled a report titled "Performance Evaluation of U.S. Weapon Systems Under IDF Combat Conditions." Its conclusion was clinical. American technology achieved complete operational dominance when integrated with adaptive field doctrine. The desert environment amplified rather than diminished performance. Translated into plain English, what was once mocked as weakness had become evolution. By the war's end, Syria's armored core was shattered. Over half its Soviet-supplied tanks lay twisted in the sand. Moscow quietly halted further T-72 exports to the Middle East that summer, officially citing technical revisions. Unofficially, it was humiliation control. In Israel, the mood was quieter, more complicated. Victories never feel clean when faces have names. Families were still waiting for the missing Baumel-Feldman cats, the ones swallowed by the fog of Sultan Yaqub. But even as grief settled, the soldiers knew they had witnessed something larger than themselves. A turning point. A proof. The Bekaa Valley wasn't just another battlefield. It was the death certificate of an idea. The idea that Western armor couldn't survive the East, that American fire couldn't thrive under foreign suns, that the desert eternal and merciless would decide the outcome. It didn't. Men did. Machines did. And the laughter. The laughter died there somewhere between the dust and the sky, where the sound of engines drowned it out forever. The last shells stopped falling on June 11, 1982. The echoes rolled through the Bekaa Valley, fading into the hills like thunder dying behind the clouds. The desert was quiet again, but it was not the same desert. It had seen too much. It had learned the sound of evolution. At dawn, the first light revealed a landscape that no human hand could ever sculpt, hundreds of wrecks scattered across the valley floor like the bones of giants. Smoke still rose in ribbons from the husks of tanks that had once been called indestructible. The air shimmered with heat, and burnt oil, the smell of iron, and defeat mingling with dust. To the camera lens it looked biblical, a valley turned to ash. The Syrians had called this place the Trap. But the trap had turned inward. Their T-72s, the pride of Soviet industry, lay gutted, their turrets blown apart, ammunition scattered across the sand like spilled teeth. Some still smoked 3 days later, shells cooking off in the heat with muffled pops. A Syrian officer, captured and bandaged, stared at the wreckage and whispered, "They told us we would bury them. The desert buried us instead." Across the valley, Israeli soldiers walked among the ruins, dazed and silent. They had survived, but the silence around them was heavier than victory. Burned uniforms clung to charred frames, rifles lay twisted beside them. The living stepped carefully between the dead friends, enemies, indistinguishable now beneath the soot. One gunner dropped to his knees beside a destroyed M60 and just stared at it. His voice cracked over the radio. "She kept us alive. She did her job." When the sun climbed higher, the full scale of what had happened became clear. Over 400 Syrian tanks had been destroyed or abandoned. Entire brigades vanished from the order of battle. Above the skies that had once belonged to the Soviets were empty 82 Syrian aircraft shot down, not one Israeli lost. The numbers were unbelievable, almost impossible, and yet there they were written in smoke and ruin. In the war rooms of Washington, analysts stared at satellite images in stunned silence. The battle they had only planned on paper, networked command, satellite coordination, electronic suppression, had unfolded perfectly in real combat. Memos flew through the Pentagon corridors, stamped "Top Secret Bekaa, proves integrated warfare viable." Someone scribbled in the margin, "The desert laughed." and then it learned to speak English. In Moscow, the silence was colder. Reports from the Soviet advisors were brief and clinical: T-72 armor compromised, fire control failure, ECM interference complete. But beneath the language of engineers was humiliation. The newest Soviet tank designed to outfight NATO had been destroyed by American-made relics 2 decades older. The Kremlin ordered an investigation. New armor, new doctrine, new excuses. But no explanation could change the photograph's blackened hulks stretching for miles. For Israel, the cost was real. 368 killed, more than 2,000 wounded. 11 tanks still missing after Sultan Yaqub. In Tel Aviv, the mood was heavy victory and grief interwoven. Mothers buried sons who had turned the tide of history. At funerals, the rabbi's prayers mingled with the distant thrum of jet engines overhead, a reminder that even mourning was temporary in a country that never stopped preparing for the next war. To the world, however, the message was clear: a new era had begun. NATO officials arrived quietly in Haifa within weeks, wearing civilian clothes, notebooks in hand. They walked through the wreckage with Israeli officers measuring penetration marks, studying burn patterns, collecting fragments of Soviet armor. The valley became an open-air classroom. One British general was overheard saying, "This is the future, and it's covered in dust." The Pentagon's after-action report was blunt. Electronic integration, satellite coordination, and precision-guided munitions achieved total dominance. Traditional armored parity no longer exists. A second note, handwritten and never published, said simply, "This is how we fight next time." And they did. 9 years later, under another sun and another sky, the ghosts of Bekaa rolled again, this time under American flags. Operation Desert Storm. The same doctrine perfected in 1982 unleashed across the sands of Kuwait. AWACS eyes in the sky, GPS-guided armor below, and Soviet-built tanks burning once more. History had come full circle. The echo of 1982 had become prophecy. But for those who had been there first, the men of Bengal's brigades, the crews who crawled out of burning tanks, that prophecy came at a price. General Avigdor Bengal stood on a ridge overlooking the valley the morning after the ceasefire. He said nothing for a long time. The journalists waiting nearby thought he was praying. Then he spoke almost to himself. "It's too quiet now." They laughed before, but no one's laughing anymore. In Damascus, propaganda ministers called it a strategic retreat. The Soviets published nothing. Yet the world had seen the photos: charred T-72s, with melted insignias, Syrian soldiers leading white flag convoys through fields of ash. Even Moscow's allies in Warsaw and Prague whispered the same phrase in disbelief: the desert turned American. Decades later, the Bekaa Valley returned to silence. Farmers planted vines over the old battle lines. Children climbed on rusted hulls, unaware that each was once a fortress. Tourists stopped for photographs, calling them ghosts of the sand. And when the wind rose, it carried with it the faint rattle of metal, the sound of history breathing in its sleep. At the Latrun Armored Museum under the open Israeli sky, one surviving M60 from Sultan Yaqub stands on display. Its armor is pitted and scarred, its turret still blackened. On its side, a bronze plate bears the words, "They laughed at the desert tanks until American fire rolled in." Visitors trace the letters with their fingers. Veterans stand beside it in silence. Some smile, some don't. Because in the end, this wasn't just a battle. It was a warning. That arrogance burns faster than fuel. That technology is only as powerful as the men who believe in it. And that the desert, eternal, patient, merciless, never laughs twice. The wind moves quietly through the valley now, carrying nothing but sand and memory. The tanks are gone, the men too, but the echo remains. You can almost hear it if you stand still long enough. that low hum of engines, that heartbeat of steel against dust. It's faint, but it's there, the sound of lessons carved into the earth. Some say the desert forgets, that it buries everything under time and silence. But the Bekaa Valley never forgot. The scars still lie beneath its vineyards, under its new roads, beneath the laughter of children who don't know what sleeps below. And every summer, when the air turns hot enough, the horizon ripples, and for a moment, it looks like the old mirage again. Tanks rolling where there are none. They laughed at the desert tanks once. They laughed at the idea that fire could live in this heat, that machines could outlast the sun. But the desert heard them, and it remembered. It watched the smoke rise, watched pride melt, watched men learn. It's always been that way. The sand never takes sides, it just keeps the score. So what if they hadn't laughed? What if the arrogance had never been spoken aloud? Would the fire still have come? Would history have burned any slower? She'd be. But the desert has a way of finding those who mock it. The Bekaa Valley sleeps now, but it sleeps with its eyes open. And somewhere in another desert under another sun, engines are starting again. Men are making the same jokes, the same promises, the same mistakes. Because history doesn't repeat, it remembers, and the desert never forgets who laughed first.